Greg Campbell is the Mayor of Cloncurry Shire Council. Thank you, Greg, for taking the time today to sit with me. How long have you been Mayor for?
Yeah, thanks and welcome to Cloncurry.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
I've been Mayor, it'll be almost 3 years in March.
Okay, and is it a full-time role, Greg, because you sit like your counterparts in more densely populated areas, I imagine, are full-time positions, so...
Not technically, but I've just about spent the last 3 years full-time, every day, trying to do something at council.
Yeah.
Just lucky with our own business. I've got family that are able to take control of that, but it's a job that you've got to put your heart and soul into, and that means a lot of time as well.
Yep, yep. And what was Cloncurry originally founded on?
Ernest Henry came out, well, it's 151 years ago. We were 150 in 2017, looking for great grazing country, and he sat atop a little rocky outcrop and looking out over the Mitchell grass plains and found copper.
Wow.
So being the entrepreneur that he was, he focused on copper mining and sent news back to his mate Roger Shire, who came out and focused on the cattle side of things.
Yeah, wow. That would have been a long journey back then, I imagine.
Yeah. We say, thinking that it was going to be a split-second SMS or something, but it probably was a 3-month journey for somebody on horseback to get back and then send a telegram, and so it was a totally different time back then.
And what area does this shire cover?
We're almost 50,000 square kilometres.
Wow.
So roughly 200 kilometres south, 200 odd kilometres to the north, and about 60 kilometres east and west.
That's a lot of roads and...
about 1,200 kilometres of roads.
Wow.
And we look after 4,000 or 5,000 people.
Yeah, yeah. And Greg, in times of disaster, councils are, the first stop for people. Is there a strategic plan in place that gives you a guide to how things should roll?
We're in charge of the local disaster group. I'm the chair of that, as is every local government. And most years we deal with some sort of rain event which cuts roads and causes some issues, but nothing has been big enough to prepare us for what we've faced in the last 3 weeks.
So this was just totally unprecedented, and I guess if you live on the coast you are prepared for cyclones and probably expect that to happen, but you certainly, this would not have been something you could have ever imagined.
No, and the contrast, like the first 3 or 4 days that it was raining, on the back of the extremely hot long period we've had, people were just reaching elation point because it looked like what had been some pretty tough conditions were finally going to break. Yeah. And then it was virtually within 24 hours we'd gone from elation to devastation, where the rain just really increased in tempo and caused major infrastructure damage and the total destruction to the cattle herd in the whole northwest.
And I guess there was a lot of shock. People just would not be able to, wouldn't have been able to understand, get their head around what they saw,
just
what
on
they were
scale,
looking at.
Yeah, nobody could fathom
the enormity of it. So, Greg, so that plan that you have in place, how successful was that in the implementation, and what was that process? So when you knew you were in trouble, I imagine you all came in here and met together.
Yep. Well, it's up to each individual council to. There's a process called from leaning forward to standing up, and that's the disaster management terms they use. We stood our disaster group up, which meant we were able to call on the state for some help if need be.
So just excuse me, the disaster group, are they made up of is that a group made up of councillors or is it made up of residents?
No, the emergency services and the council, so the police, the SES, the ambulance, the hospital.
Volunteers, are there any volunteers?
No. That's a professional type group leading all the agencies that respond to the any emergency. And council coordinates all them with the support of the district group, which in our district is based in Mount Isa, and that's made up of the police and officer from Emergency Management Queensland.
So you all met together, and then what steps did you take?
Oh, well, in a standard event, that's around closing roads once they get flooded and cut, and then monitoring them, and talking to people that are in the impact zone of, in our case, the Crella Dam, because there's people downstream of that need to be notified that it's rising. We monitor our own dam to make sure that it's we know the levels at the dam, and then just go through that process while it's still raining, and then that flows into opening roads and whatever processes have to be put in place to get roads opened again quickly, making sure that people that are isolated have food and their medicine. So within a few hours of the rain stopping, we had helicopters flying food drops and medicine drops to people, and then as the enormity grew, that's when we escalated that we needed some bigger assistance and the need for fodder drops, and that's when the Army got called in to help with that. That's when other agencies of the state get activated to help us. So the DAF helped coordinate all the fodder drops under our direction, and it just gives us the ability to draw in assistance from state agencies as needed.
Yeah. So Greg, you knew that the roads and bridges and infrastructure had gone in a lot of cases, but at what point did you realise the trouble that the producers were in with losing livestock?
It was probably reasonably early we started getting some feedback that producers were starting to lose cattle, and early on that was just in the heights of the water, and it was the next day or so that when it was the big massive downpours overnight, and then the wind picked up as well, that we were getting reports that was having a big impact as well. Yeah. And really I don't know if we still know accurately how big an impact it is. We know it's anywhere from 300,000 to could be 750,000. Yeah. It'll be a while before we know the exact number, but it's still, any way you look at it, it's a big number.
Yeah, yeah. And these disasters are categorised, aren't they? So what category did this start off at?
Yep. And the categories is the amount of assistance that producers can get off the state and that businesses can get. So it was category B relatively quickly, and that's something that as mayors we asked the state for, and that can be enacted. But as it was evolving,
what could you expect as a category B?
Category B's not a lot. It's some freight subsidies, right. And I think $5,000 or so. So it's a bit of a help in a minor type event, but we quickly knew that wasn't going to be enough, and the mayors of the Northwest, I think we've been speaking in unison, which has probably made the escalation happen so much quicker, because there was not just one voice saying this is a big deal, there was 7 of us. So the state have to write to the federal government looking to raise that level.
So you approach the state government?
Yes.
And then the state government approach the federal government?
Yep. And we'd approach both simultaneously. Okay. Because it's such a big issue, we needed both to know quickly, so to make sure that they were working together as well. And I think within a day or so, any issues between state and federal lines were gone, and we had a direct link to the Prime Minister. The Premier came to visit. Well, the first one that came out was the Federal Ag Minister, David Littleproud, and by then Category C had been enacted, which meant that our producers had access to $25,000 grants. Virtually overnight from David Littleproud's visit, that had been tripled to $75,000.
So did he physically fly around?
He physically came out and flew around, met a couple of producers on the ground at their properties, and that was before the bulk of the water was even getting to the Gulf. but he flew over about 40 kilometres of what essentially had become an inland sea. So that was before a lot of that country was even visible to see the losses, but just the amount of water and the good advice that he was getting from people on the ground, it was blatantly obvious that we were looking at a disaster that we've never seen before.
And how bad do things have to be before you call the army in? And who's responsible for calling the army in?
Yeah, well, as far as I know, the state have to request that, but it's up to the federal government to say yes, and that all happened very quickly as well. The army had been called in Townsville a few days before, and one of the amazing things about the support we got from the army pilots and all their support crews, a lot of them had their own homes impacted in Townsville because that brigade is based in Townsville. Yeah. They had other friends and family who were badly affected, yet they were still able to put that aside and come out and help the producers and the communities of the Northwest. So it was an amazing effort by them.
So we're 3 weeks on, and fences are starting to get fixed with the help of a lot of volunteers. Cattle are starting to get buried, but what's the future? How do you go forward from this?
Yep. Well, again, collectively and individually as mayors, we've been lobbying state and federal governments. There's been a whole swathe of ministers and director generals come to visit, which they have to be on the ground to understand the breadth of this disaster and what we need. We're starting to put our own plans in place, for the short term, which to me is now until 12 months, 12 months to 2 years, and then 2 years to 5 years. And what we need funding-wise for infrastructure and support. The announcement by the PM on Friday of, I think it's up to a $2 billion support package, will be a huge boost, because we're not going to get back up on our feet without external help. We need our governments to help us.
So what are some of the challenges that you're going to be that producers and local business owners are going to be facing in these coming years?
Short term is definitely cash flow. For a property that's lost their young cattle and their breeders, they've lost this year's income and next year's income with their young cattle, and if they've lost their breeders, they've potentially lost their future income as well. So they need to be able to get cattle back on their places to get income back in, and whether short term that might be even adjustment cattle, so at least they're getting that cash in. Yeah. And the next issue with no income is how to pay their bills. And one of the first questions we asked the Prime Minister was to get the banks to essentially be nice, and we've had that commitment directly from the Prime Minister that he's willing to and pushing that strongly, and we've got that commitment from the banks. I think it's across the board, but there's to be no foreclosures within 3 years to affected properties. People can talk to their bank immediately about getting interest halted, or to work out what they're going to do in the short term. There's no better time to restructure businesses and to take advantage of the generosity that's out there, especially from the corporates.
So Greg, at the very beginning we talked about, you said Cloncurry was actually founded with the mining industry, with Ernest Henry. So does a strong relationship still exist between the mining industry and the beef industry, in this area?
Oh, especially in the Cloncurry Shire. That's one of the reasons why we are such a strong shire, because we've got a very strong pastoral background and a fantastic mining history, and they have grown up together. And through this disaster, Ernest Henry mine was the staging point for our fodder drops. To get the hay out of our airport, which is regulated, so that had its own issues. We moved the hay out onto the mine site, and the mine provided staff and machinery to help load the helicopters.
Wow.
And that put the hay 40 kilometres out into where it had to go. Yeah. At the same time, they were dealing with their own problems. Yeah. They had faced the huge rainfall that the graziers had as well, and it had big impacts on their mining infrastructure. And then once we've realised how serious the damage to the railway line especially is, that's put our mining operations in the whole of the northwest into limbo. And every week, one mine in particular, while the railway line's out, they're losing $10 million a week.
How long before that will be ready to be used again, the railway line?
Queensland Rail's put their time frame out, and I think it's a great timeline. They've talked between 8 and 12 weeks.
Whose responsibility is that? Is it Queensland Rail's responsibility to fix that at a state level?
Yeah, so the state owns Queensland Rail, but across the industries, everyone's putting their hand up to help. It's not a finger pointing thing that it's your problem. We need this fixed, and we need it fixed well, so everyone's pitching in to help.
Yeah, and that was what the other question I was going to ask you. With what has happened here, do you think people see, like the rest of the state or rest of Australia, see it as just a problem that's unique to you, or do you think people think it's everybody's problem because it's going to impact us down the line?
Yep. Well, the actual site or ground zero of the disaster is definitely on our doorstep. Yeah. But the ramifications is across the whole of North Queensland. It's across the southeast of Queensland, and it's national. If our grazing industry and the beef industry is worth billions, it's one of our top 5. I think the top, it's the 4th biggest export industry we have. Mining's well and truly up there. If between those two industries they buckle, it's not just going to be disastrous for us and our communities, it's going to hit the state, and it's going to hit the nation as well.
So would you say these regional councils have been well supported by state and federal governments throughout these past few weeks?
Yes. Yeah. Yep. And I think that's evidenced by how quickly we've had the Prime Minister and the Premier both come to visit. Yeah. And the responses, there's been, especially from the Prime Minister, to say, if there's any issues with banks, if there's any issues with his departments, ring and he'll get it fixed. Yeah. There's been no second guessing themselves. He's been just direct in genuine support to get us back on our feet as quickly as possible. Yeah.
That's amazing, the direct line of communication that you have, that he has opened up. Thank you so much, Greg.
No worries, thank you.